They like to say the American West was won by courage and destiny. But there was a moment when that destiny met resistance so absolute that it forced a nation to confront itself. And that resistance had a name: Sitting Bull, a man who did not ride for conquest, did not fight for glory, and did not believe he was meant to lose even when the world around him insisted that he must. Sitting Bull was born into a land that did not see itself as a frontier. To his people, it was not empty, not wild, not waiting to be claimed. It was home. Rivers had names, hills had meaning, every horizon carried memory. Long before railroads and maps, this land had order, law, and tradition, and Sitting Bull was raised inside that structure, learning early that leadership was not taken by force, but earned through patience, vision, and the ability to protect others without surrendering identity. As the United States expanded westward, it brought with it an idea that would collide violently with Sitting Bull's world: progress. To America, progress meant railroads, settlements, borders, and control. To the Lakota, it meant erasure. Treaties were signed and broken, promises were made and ignored. Soldiers arrived where elders once stood, and Sitting Bull watched all of it with a clarity that made him dangerous. He was not reckless, he was deliberate. Sitting Bull understood something few leaders on either side fully grasped. This was not a series of battles. It was a war of endurance. Whoever surrendered their way of life first would lose everything, and Sitting Bull refused to be the one who blinked. As a spiritual leader as much as a warrior, Sitting Bull carried authority that could not be stripped away by military rank. His words mattered. His visions guided decisions. When others debated compromise, he spoke of survival without submission. When fear spread, he steadied it. And when conflict became unavoidable, he did not hesitate. But he never confused violence with victory. His goal was not to destroy America. It was to remain Lakota. The pressure mounted. Forts appeared. Buffalo herds vanished. The lifeblood of the plains was being cut away systematically. Sitting Bull saw the strategy clearly: starve the people, and resistance collapses without a single decisive battle. This was not accidental, it was policy, and it hardened his resolve. He gathered warriors not through promises of glory but through truth. That the future being offered meant dependency. That survival inside reservations would come at the cost of dignity. That once land was surrendered, it would never be returned. These were not speeches meant to inspire rebellion. They were warnings meant to preserve existence. As tensions escalated, the United States labeled Sitting Bull a problem, a threat, a symbol of resistance that needed to be neutralized. But symbols are powerful precisely because they cannot be arrested easily. Sitting Bull did not represent chaos. He represented refusal. And refusal is the most dangerous thing an expanding empire can face. When violence finally erupted into full-scale confrontation, it was not because Sitting Bull sought war. It was because every alternative had been exhausted. His people were being pushed toward a future they did not choose. And in that moment, he chose to stand, knowing full well what that would cost. This was not the story of a man fighting progress. It was the story of a man fighting disappearance. And in doing so, Sitting Bull forced America to confront a question it had avoided for too long. What happens when the price of expansion is someone else's extinction? As the United States pushed deeper into the Great Plains, the conflict with the Lakota was no longer just about territory. It became about control of time itself, because the government understood something brutal and strategic. You do not always need to defeat a people in a single battle if you can slowly remove the conditions that allow them to live. Sitting Bull saw that strategy unfolding year by year, and he understood the danger more clearly than most of his enemies did. Guns could be faced, armies could be avoided, but starvation, displacement, and the disappearance of the buffalo were forces that crept in quietly. And once they tightened, they did not loosen. The buffalo herds were the heartbeat of life on the plains. They were food, clothing, shelter, tools, and identity. When the herds were destroyed, it was not only an economic catastrophe, it was an existential one. Sitting Bull watched hunters, traders, and opportunists slaughter buffalo by the thousands, sometimes leaving carcasses to rot, taking only hides and tongues, turning the plains into a graveyard of waste. What America called commerce, the Lakota experienced as an attack on survival. And as the herds thinned, the pressure on native communities grew unbearable. At the same time, treaties were signed in rooms far away from the people who would pay for them. Paper promised peace while the ground shifted beneath their feet. Agreements were broken whenever gold was discovered, whenever railroads needed land, whenever settlers demanded protection. Soldiers built forts not as defensive structures but as markers of inevitability. Each fort was a message. The government is not leaving. The West will be controlled. Resistance will be punished. Sitting Bull's leadership grew stronger as the situation worsened. He was not simply organizing raids or calling warriors to battle. He was organizing identity. He reminded people that surrender was not merely a tactical choice. It was a transformation that could never be undone. He urged bands to remain independent, to hunt freely as long as they could, and to resist the slow pull into reservation life. He knew that once families accepted government rations, once children were taken into schools designed to erase language and culture, the war would be lost without a single bullet fired. Yet the pressure was relentless. Winter hit harder when buffalo were scarce. Hunger weakened the old and the young. Raiders from rival tribes competed for shrinking resources. The plains, once a landscape of abundance, became a landscape of desperate calculation. This is where many leaders would have broken, choosing compromise simply to keep their people alive. Sitting Bull did not chose that path, but he refused to walk it himself. He believed that life without dignity was not truly life at all. The United States interpreted his refusal as a direct threat to national progress. Officials could not tolerate a leader who rejected the government's authority entirely. Sitting Bull was labeled defiant, dangerous, uncooperative. Words that often meant the same thing in American frontier policy. The more he resisted, the more aggressively the government moved to isolate him. Patrols increased. Surveillance tightened. Pressure was applied to other leaders to distance themselves from him. The goal was to cut Sitting Bull off, to make him look like a lone obstacle rather than a symbol that could inspire others. But Sitting Bull was never alone. He represented a truth many Native leaders knew but could not say openly. The expansion of the United States was not a peaceful process. It was coercion backed by force. And once coercion becomes the foundation of a relationship, trust dies permanently. Sitting Bull did not trust promises because he had watched promises fail too many times. If this story is pulling you in, take a moment now. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below whether you think resistance like Sitting Bull's was courage, or an impossible stand against an unstoppable system. Because what comes next will challenge how you think about the West entirely. By the mid-1870s, tensions were reaching a breaking point. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills, land the Lakota considered sacred and that treaties had recognized as theirs, triggered a rush of miners and settlers. The government, instead of enforcing its own agreements, looked for ways to justify taking the land anyway. Sitting Bull understood immediately what this meant. This was not an accident. This was the moment the treaty system collapsed completely. The Black Hills were not just territory. They were spiritual ground. To take them was to announce that nothing was protected, not even what had been formally promised. Sitting Bull's resistance hardened into something iron. He urged people to leave the reservations and gather, to stand together, to refuse to accept a future decided by outsiders. The gathering of tribes and bands grew into a powerful statement. We will not surrender our sacred ground without a fight. This is the moment where the story begins to accelerate, where policy turns into pursuit, where resistance turns into conflict, and where Sitting Bull's name begins to echo far beyond the plains, because America was about to send a message to the Lakota and their allies, and Sitting Bull was about to send one back. As pressure closed in from every direction, Sitting Bull understood that the conflict had reached a point of no return. Gathering of Lakota, Cheyenne, and allied bands outside the reservation system was no longer just an act of defiance. It was a declaration. By refusing to submit, these communities were forcing the United States to make a choice it had tried to avoid. Either honor its own treaties and limits or openly admit that expansion would continue regardless of law, promise, or consequence. Sitting Bull's role during this period was not that of a battlefield commander barking orders in the chaos of gunfire. His authority operated on a deeper level. He was the center of gravity that held disparate groups together, many of whom had old rivalries, different leaders, and conflicting interests. What unified them was not strategy alone, but belief. Sitting Bull embodied the belief that survival without surrender was still possible, even as the odds narrowed. In the summer of 1876, that belief reached its most visible and most dangerous form. American military leadership, frustrated by Sitting Bull's refusal to report to reservations, labeled him an outlaw. Orders were given to force all non-compliant bands into submission. Columns of soldiers moved across the plains not to negotiate, but to compel obedience. This was no longer about peacekeeping. It was about breaking resistance as an example. Sitting Bull anticipated this. Long before soldiers closed in, he had prepared his people mentally and spiritually for what was coming. He understood that fear fractures unity faster than bullets. Through ceremonies and visions, he reinforced resolve. One of his visions, later widely recounted, showed soldiers falling into the Lakota camp like grasshoppers from the sky, a symbolic warning, but also a promise. To Sitting Bull and those who trusted him, it meant that the coming confrontation would not end the way America expected. The Battle of the Little Bighorn would later dominate headlines and history books, but what many forget is that Sitting Bull did not lead the charge that day. His power was not tactical positioning or direct combat. His power was preparation. He helped create the conditions that made unified resistance possible. Warriors followed leaders like Crazy Horse into battle, but they stood there in the first place because Sitting Bull had refused to accept a future of quiet disappearance. When news reached the United States that an entire column under George Armstrong Custer had been destroyed, the shock was immediate and profound. This was not supposed to happen. The narrative of inevitable expansion did not include defeat. Sitting Bull, whether physically present at the fighting or not, became the symbol of that humiliation. In the American imagination, he transformed overnight from a troublesome leader into a dangerous icon of resistance, but victory carried consequences heavier than celebration. Sitting Bull knew this. He understood that the defeat of Custer would not end the conflict. It would intensify it. America could absorb embarrassment, but it would not tolerate defiance on such a scale. Retaliation was inevitable, and it would be systematic, overwhelming, and relentless. The machinery of the state was now fully engaged. In the months that followed, the pressure became unbearable. Military forces increased. Food supplies dwindled. Bands that once moved freely were hunted continuously. Allies began to fracture under exhaustion and fear. Sitting Bull faced the most difficult leadership challenge of his life: how to protect his people when resistance itself had become a magnet for destruction. He chose exile over surrender. Crossing into Canada, Sitting Bull sought refuge beyond the immediate reach of U.S. forces. It was not an escape born of fear, but of calculation. He hoped that distance would buy time, that conditions might change, that diplomacy might eventually replace pursuit. But exile brought its own hardships. Food was scarce, port was limited, winter was unforgiving, and the farther time stretched on, the clearer it became that the world he was holding on to was slipping away no matter where he stood. Yet even in exile, Sitting Bull refused to submit. He rejected offers designed to neutralize him symbolically. He refused to become a trophy or a spokesman for a system he did not believe in. His presence alone continued to represent defiance, and that defiance unsettled American authorities deeply. They understood something crucial. Killing Sitting Bull might create a martyr. Letting him live meant allowing resistance to remain alive in memory. Eventually, exhaustion forced a choice no leader wants to make. To return south meant surrendering under terms dictated by the very government he had resisted. To remain north meant slow starvation. Sitting Bull chose survival for his people over symbolic victory. He crossed back into American territory, not defeated, but constrained by reality. The war of movement was over. The war of memory was just beginning, because even as the plains fell silent under military control, Sitting Bull's stand had already done something irreversible. It had proven that expansion was not destiny without cost. It had shown that resistance, even when it fails, leaves scars that history cannot erase. And America was about to learn that conquering land was far easier than conquering the meaning of what had been taken. When Sitting Bull returned to the United States, the war everyone could see was over. But the war that mattered most had only just begun. The plains were no longer free. The buffalo were gone. The great gatherings had dissolved. Soldiers controlled movement, food, and survival itself. To many observers, Sitting Bull's return looked like defeat. To Sitting Bull, it was something else entirely. The final act of protecting what could still be protected when force had reached its limit. Reservation life was designed to break more than bodies. It was designed to break identity. Language was discouraged. Traditions were controlled. Dependence replaced autonomy. Sitting Bull understood this immediately, and he resisted in the only way still available to him. He refused to disappear. He refused to become silent. Even confined, even monitored, he remained a symbol that could not be fully neutralized. His presence alone reminded both Native people and American authorities that submission did not equal agreement. The United States attempted to manage Sitting Bull rather than eliminate him. He was too famous to kill quietly, too influential to ignore. Officials tried to turn him into a harmless figure, a curiosity, a relic, a man from a finished chapter. At one point, he even traveled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, not as a surrender but as a calculated move. Sitting Bull understood the power of visibility. If America wanted to turn him into a spectacle, he would use that stage to ensure he was seen, not erased. He did not endorse the myth. He occupied it. But even this strategy had limits. Back on the reservation, pressure mounted again as the federal government grew increasingly anxious about unrest. New movements emerged among Native communities, offering hope through spiritual revival and the promise of renewal. To American authorities, these movements looked like rebellion waiting to happen. Sitting Bull, as always, became the focal point of that fear. Not because he commanded armies, but because he commanded meaning. The decision to arrest him was born out of panic, not strategy. Officials believed removing Sitting Bull would remove resistance itself. History has shown how tragically wrong that assumption was. In December of 1890, when Indian police arrived to take him into custody, confusion and tension escalated rapidly. Shots were fired. Chaos erupted. Sitting Bull was killed, not in battle, not in defiance, but in the very place meant to control him. His death sent shockwaves far beyond the reservation. It did not bring peace. It did not bring closure. Instead, it exposed the deepest failure of American expansion, the belief that eliminating a symbol would erase what that symbol stood for. Sitting Bull's life ended, but his meaning did not. In many ways, it became stronger. Today, Sitting Bull stands as one of the most complex figures in American history. He was not simply a warrior. He was not simply a victim. He was a leader who understood that land can be taken, bodies can be controlled, but memory is far more difficult to conquer. His resistance forced America to confront the moral cost of its growth, a cost often buried beneath narratives of progress and destiny. If the Old West is remembered only as a story of courage and conquest, it is incomplete. Sitting Bull's story restores what was stripped away: context, consequence, and humanity. He reminds us that expansion always has two sides, and that the voices pushed aside do not vanish just because they are inconvenient. If this story made you see the American West differently, take a moment now. Leave a like to support honest history. Subscribe to the channel for long-form stories that confront myth with truth. And comment below, do you believe Sitting Bull lost his fight, or did he win something far more lasting? Because in the end, Sitting Bull did not win by force. He won by refusing to be forgotten. And that victory still unsettles history today.